Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kenneth, and I am the Chief Operations Officer here at Naluri. We're going to be spending some time today talking about an important topic in today's changing times, right? And that is empathy in leadership. Now, it wasn't long ago that many business leaders viewed terms like empathy and vulnerability or trust and caring as fundamentally incompatible and irreconcilable with the serious and technical world of business. But times have changed. The COVID-19 pandemic from 2020 has created a seismic shift in business leadership. The traditional business approach of setting strategy and business plans and applying disciplined Six Sigma operational execution does not work when entire markets and industries are turned upside down, plans are thrown out of the window, and teams have to suddenly learn how to be agile, flexible, and curious. And how many of you have experienced this in the last 2 years? That all those carefully set plans and strategies are suddenly almost irrelevant, and what we have instead is a whole lot of ambiguity and uncertainty. In such times, top-down directive and command and control leadership has to make way for a coaching, empathetic, and empowering style to bring out the best in team members, so that they are not paralyzed by the fear of the unknown, but rather embrace the opportunities of doing work differently and creatively. We have to help both leaders and employees become resilient and thrive in the face of extreme stress, pressure, and frequent setbacks and failure, and certainly not succumb to burnout, depression, and anxiety. While leaders now accept this new reality, the conversation is just getting started. And many are still falling short in actually changing how they manage and lead teams. It's great that many organizations are recognizing the importance of empathetic leadership at work, but we have to be careful that we don't just talk about it. Unfortunately, that is the risk, that this conversation just stops at cries of be more empathetic, be more understanding. But we need to take it a step further and recognize that empathy is a technical skill that can be learned and applied systematically. Empathy is a noun. It's the thing that you've acquired after you've listened to someone and truly understand their point of view. Let's start today by dispelling 3 common myths around empathy. The first myth is that empathy is just a feeling. Many people believe that empathy is just a feeling or emotion. It definitely involves feelings, but it is much more than that. To understand empathy in a more concrete manner, let's break it down into different subtypes. First, there is cognitive empathy, which is a rational process that's used to uncover another person's beliefs, their values, their preferences, and their points of view. This is already ingrained in the work of marketeers or researchers, writers, designers, front-end engineers, sales executives, and customer service teams. Cognitive empathy is purposeful and intentional. Now, another type of empathy is emotional empathy. And this is more reflexive or intuitive. It happens to you. It's your reaction when you feel similar feelings when you hear about someone experiencing something happy, joyful, or sorrowful. Like feeling empathetic joy when you hear of a friend who passed an exam or got promoted, and feeling empathetic sadness when you hear of a friend who lost a family member or lost their job. The second myth is that empathy is irrelevant for technical or quantitative jobs like banking, finance, engineering, you name it. When most people think about the skills needed to be an effective engineer, accountant, or lawyer, empathy may not be the first thing that comes to mind. Excelling in all these technical and professional roles requires excellent communication skills. You need to understand and relate to the issues and challenges faced by the people you serve. And excellent communications is not about conveying the points you want to come across, but packaging your information in a way that will be accepted by the other party, which means knowing when is the best time to communicate, what is the best style or language, and what is the best channel for communication. Now, effectiveness varies for each individual, and even for one individual, the effective way to communicate will change at different times. So empathy is required to first connect and understand before we communicate what we want to say. The third myth is that empathy cannot be taught. Now think about the most effective communicators. Doctors who take the time to connect with each patient to understand what their fears and concerns are, what their life's priorities are, and what they are prepared to trade off, instead of just giving a cold diagnosis and different treatment options and expecting the patient to decide. Or the banker who takes the time to understand an entrepreneur's vision, values, and how he or she makes investment decisions and crafts the right financial strategy and plan, instead of giving a standard financial product and expecting the client to accept or decline it. Or a team leader who makes the time to have meaningful one-on-one conversations with their employees and helps the employees see how their tasks at work fit with what they are personally passionate about and how they want to achieve their personal life goals. All of these empathetic communicators are trained, either formally or through experience. They weren't born with it, nor did they have these skills on day one of their jobs. So here are 3 guiding principles that you can lean on to build up your aptitude for empathy in the workplace. First principle, swap blame for honor. You might be familiar with this scenario. An engineering manager revisits old code written in a software program, or a corporate finance manager reviews the formulas for a financial model built in Microsoft Excel, or maybe an audit and compliance manager who reviews the approvals documentation of a past investment decision. They find this old code or model or documentation totally inscrutable. They can't interpret it, they can't make any sense of it, and they get frustrated. The usual reaction is, my goodness, who was the idiot who decided to do it like this? Blame is so often baked into our managerial DNA because virtually all managers were once the individual contributors, the ones who had to do the actual code, the actual model, the actual report, and experience frustration when other people don't perform at the level that they were at when they were in that role. But here's the thing. Shaming that original team member wastes precious time and energy. We need to move beyond blame and shame. They're unproductive, and they're the opposite of empathy. Instead, honor the work of the people who came before you. Think, okay, I assume the people did their best work. Why did they choose this solution? What were the circumstances that led to this issue? How can we avoid this from happening again? The reality is no one wakes up in the morning and decides to write the worst code or build the worst financial model or write the messiest report. That just doesn't make sense. People are up against real-world constraints that impact quality: time, budget, technical limitations, a lack of training, unrealistic expectations. Now, if we took the time to dig into these constraints with a view to understand and relate to why the situations happen, and to uncover the real reasons why the work isn't up to your expectations, that would be a real step forward. On the other hand, if you scream, you yell, and threaten, guess what's going to happen? Your team members will learn to keep their mouths shut and not be open to actually learn to get better. Now, we might think as managers sometimes that putting the fear of God will make them remember the issue and not take it lightly in the future. But instead, what they will remember was how small and worthless you made them feel. And they wouldn't be in a state that is receptive to reflect and learn about what really needs to change to avoid these mistakes from recurring. Second tip is to communicate like a copywriter. In today's workplace, particularly as we move to remote or hybrid models, over 70% of workplace communications take place in written forms, either through instant messaging tools like Slack, Teams, Skype, or WhatsApp, email, or perhaps even collaboration software like Trello, ClickUp, Monday.com, etc. Now, some of the biggest problems arise when people misinterpret our intent, when we send written messages because they do not see non-verbal cues like our body language or our tone of voice, or because they're asynchronous, meaning non-live sessions where you cannot immediately ask for clarification. So here are some pointers. Keep your tone casual and conversational. Many people feel the pressure to decorate their language with extravagant jargon or intricate syntax in a work setting. Resist that urge. The most effective language is clear, concise, and natural. Good writing is simple writing. Think about using the second person active voice. In second person, the writer directly addresses the reader using you. The active voice makes clear that the reader is carrying out the action. For example, instead of a passive, an error has been detected, an alternative to that, and which would be more active and more empathetic, is sorry that you have experienced this error. That makes it sound a lot more human and natural. We should also not make assumptions. Don't assume that everyone who is reading your writing knows everything about what you're writing about, especially if you're addressing a technical subject. Take the time to explain it a little bit. If you're using an acronym, spell out each word the first time it's used. That way, your writing is more accessible to readers who have different skills and strengths from you. Be deliberate as well in choosing the appropriate channel. Now, the three most common team communication channels in the workplace today are emails, instant messaging, and video meeting tools. Of these, email is usually the most formal and deliberate channel. Now, timing of emails is getting faster. A 2015 study by the USC School of Engineering found that 50% of email responses were sent within 1 hour. For those between 20 to 35 years old, that number went down to 16 minutes. Those between 35 to 50 years old typically answered within 24 minutes, and those above 50 took 47 minutes to reply. A majority of emails are now responded to using mobile phones that led to these quick response rates. However, because email is becoming faster and faster paced, try to let the other party know if you've received their email but need more than a few hours to respond. It's better to reply with a quick, "Got it, I'll get back to you by Tuesday," rather than to leave the recipient waiting and potentially getting anxious or feeling disrespected. Emails longer than 5 sentences tend to get skimmed over. For more complex topics and assignments, either opt for a phone call or meeting, or make sure you're using bullet points, bold and italic text, and highlighting the action points at the end of the email. Do I or the other person need more context outside of the email? If so, then the discussion probably requires a face-to-face or video conference meeting. Here are a few more pro tips. The first is use reply all sparingly. How many of us have been in this situation where we get CC'd on an email with 35,000 other people, right? Now, generally, this kind of an email is only necessary if it's a one-time team announcement or notification, because out of those 35,000 people, 34,990 probably are not going to read it. Now, if you plan to add people in CC because you only want to inform them, be explicit at the top of the email why you copied them on this email. Give them that context. Here's another pro tip. Clear the deck. If your email chain has gone on for more than 3 or 4 rounds of back and forth, your entire subject line is likely now a row of re and forwards and so on and so forth, right? And perhaps even the whole direction of this conversation has changed and that title is no longer representative. So feel free to replace those titles with a relevant, concise, action-oriented subject line for the email that you're about to send. You also want to avoid anxiety-inducing subject lines like, "Please call me," or "See the CEO in her office." This is the workplace equivalent of "We need to talk," and it's just never necessary. This is not what we mean by being action-oriented. Brief does not mean lacking context. And when we think about instant messaging, channels like or platforms like WhatsApp and Slack and Microsoft Teams have surged in popularity. And in some organizations, they have even surpassed emails in terms of volume of communications. These platforms and channels are meant to be informal and instant. Responses are expected within the hour. although most come within 3 minutes or less. If you receive an instant messaging message during a meeting and you're unable to respond within that hour-long time frame, it's probably best to let the recipient know the reason for the delay in your response. It may seem unnecessary, but it can help to diffuse any anger or annoyance that start to develop when they're waiting for a response. At the same time, it's also important to create explicit boundaries. Unfortunately, the instant nature of these platforms can be misleading. How many of us have been in those situations where these messages and notifications keep chiming in and we feel that need to respond immediately to each and every one of them? And at the end of a long day, we realize that we've spent 6 hours answering emails and messages and not actually doing any work. And perhaps even worse, some people are often tempted to use these text and instant messaging channels outside of work hours and still expect a quick response. It's perfectly reasonable to set boundaries if you wish to do so. If it's the first time, respond to that off-hour text with a quick message, alerting the sender to the fact that you won't be responding until work resumes. That way, you show that you have received the message while avoiding people waiting without a response or frantically trying to follow up, and you would have stuck to your own boundaries. Consider as well, if you're working in a team, a list of acronyms to make very clear or explicit expectations on responses. For example, NNTR, no need to respond. SOS, urgent. Or IMRL, in meeting, respond later. If there is an emergency that does require an urgent response, especially after office hours, consider calling rather than expecting team members to reply to text messages with the same urgency that you expect. For video meeting tools such as Zoom or Teams or WebEx, they are now part of everyday business culture. Yet they continue to be a huge source of stress, anxiety, and burnout. Even the CEO of Zoom himself shared that he experienced Zoom fatigue. And Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan, one of the largest banks in the world, has said he's had enough and he's done with Zoom meetings. We all know about sources of technical frustrations like, you're on mute, can you hear me? Or, the opposite side, when people are not on mute and have background noises or side conversations that just disrupts the whole flow of the meeting. Empathetic leaders should consider actively chairing meetings and ensuring participants are engaged. Here are some pointers. First of all is status updates should always be done offline in collaboration tools. Instead of going around a virtual meeting room one by one to verbally share what we are doing and how we're progressing. Now, if this is practice, most people start to tune out when others are talking, and that creates a silo culture, right? If these go around the room exercises are done, it should focus only on, are there any issues or any other matters that each person wants to bring up for discussion. For people who have to turn off their cameras, either because of low bandwidth or a poor environment, team leaders should proactively check in with them to see that they remain engaged. Use also the chat window to ask people to type in their views so that conversations are not dominated by a few loud participants and we end up excluding others. We'll address this more later when we talk about remote collaboration, but the most important point about all of this is about making these communications norms explicit. Write them down. Get all your team members to understand and agree, but also allow for edits to be made along the way as you adjust and learn. We are all living in unprecedented times. And it is okay for us to learn along the way. Now, interestingly, back in 2018, an organizational psychologist and professor at the Wharton Business School had a closed-door session with Fortune 500 CEOs and leaders of the largest tech companies and unicorns. He wanted to promote hybrid remote work, and he wanted to see which of these leaders were prepared to run an experiment where they allowed their employees to work anywhere, at home or in a coffee shop or anywhere else, right? Every Friday, just one day a week. And every single leader dismissed the idea. no one wanted to implement it. They didn't want to open a Pandora's box because they believed that when employees were not working from the office, they were not focused or engaged. They believed employees would procrastinate and their cultures would fall apart. But fast forward 3 years, now these are the same leaders who have committed to allowing permanent remote work, or at least hybrid work. And it was such a missed opportunity to challenge our status quo. We could have used 2018 and 2019 to work out how to make remote work before the pandemic hit in 2020. But what does it then take to build a culture where team members embrace thinking again? Where instead of escalating commitment to the way things have been done in the past, they get excited about running experiments, to try new ideas, to question assumptions, and to reject the status quo. The first and most important thing about this is to create psychological safety. Psychological safety is when you can take a risk at work without being punished. When teams feel psychologically safe, they are willing to talk freely about their mistakes. They're willing to learn, to prevent them, and to rethink the practices that caused them in the first place. But when they don't feel psychologically safe, they hide their errors and they become much more prone to repeating them. Now, here's an example of Google. At Google, the single biggest predictor of high performance teams was not the talent on the team. It was not the meaning and purpose that the teams experienced at work. But they found that it was whether team leaders created psychological safety. Because when this existed, the team members let their ideas and suggestions fly. When it didn't, they held back. And you can think of psychological safety as a critical resource for preventing errors, for promoting innovation, and also for creating a sense of inclusion. The challenge that leaders will face today is, how do we create that psychological safety? So let's think about this for a second. What's the number one way that leaders shut down psychological safety, perhaps inadvertently? When they say, "Don't come to me with problems, come with a solution." Think about a boss in your career that regularly said that. How many of you today have been told this by your bosses? Or perhaps you've even told this to your team members. Now, I get why leaders say this. You want your team members to be constructive. You don't want them to just highlight problems and issues and complain. But this is a dangerous philosophy, because if people can only speak up when they have a solution, you will never hear about the biggest problems that are too complex for any one person to solve. The foundation of building psychological safety is making it okay for people to raise problems, even if they don't have a solution yet. Now, that empowers employees to detect problems, to speak up, even if they lack the authority or the expertise or the resources to do something about the problem. And you need to hear about what the problems are before you figure out what you need to rethink. And how do you do that? Warby Parker, the billion-dollar unicorn eyeglass retailer that is disrupting the global dominance of Luxottica, practiced this. Four out of 5 of Warby's biggest innovations have come out of a suggestion or complaints box. Now, this may sound strange or traditional, right? But if you see any problem in the company, it could be a technical bug, it could be a management error, it could be a culture issue, people would submit it into a Google document, and then leaders would rate how important these problems are, which means you get feedback on whether you are raising critical issues. And if anyone wanted to work on solving one of the problems identified as a critical issue, it becomes part of their job. And they could build a team around them. And they would get the resources to tackle it. A problem or complaints box is just a process, right? Or a tool. But it is the beginning of a rethinking process. It channels our energy towards the issues that need to be addressed before it's too late. It's also important for all of us as leaders to build a challenge network. Now, we'll talk about what that means in a moment, right? But in order to do this, in order to get people to submit problems, you often need a different kind of network around you. Now, when most of us think about having a network, we think about having a support network. The people we trust to cheerlead us and to help us and to encourage us. You might think of these people as givers, the people who are constantly asking, what can I do for you? And the opposite of a giver is a taker, someone who always says, what can you do for me? Now, it may be obvious that you want your support network to have givers rather than takers because you can trust them. But we get fooled a lot by who the givers are. There's a personality trait that misleads us. It's called agreeableness. You may know agreeable people as warm, friendly, welcoming, and the disagreeable people as critical, skeptical, challenging, likely to become, engineers, lawyers, or auditors. That's not actually a joke, right? That's actually an empirical finding. For a long time, we assumed agreeable people were givers and disagreeable people were takers. Because if you're a nice person, you're also going to be helpful. But Adam Grant gathered data across 30,000 people, across multiple industries and countries, and he found that there was zero correlation between agreeable, disagreeable tendencies and giving and taking as values. Agreeableness or disagreeableness is our surface personality. How pleasant it is to interact with you, how much harmony do you create? Whereas giving and taking are your inner motives. What are your real values and intentions when you deal with other people? Now, of course, this is grossly simplifying all the complexities of human nature, but if you want to understand people accurately, it helps to create a 2x2 matrix of agreeable, disagreeable tendencies on the y-axis and giver-taker traits on the x-axis. Now, you'll find two combinations that you recognize quickly and two that you might overlook. Let's start with disagreeable takers. We do not waste time with these people. You might call them by a less polite name. Now, we get fooled a lot by agreeable takers. Also, another name for them is fakers, who are nice to your face but stab you in the back. The quintessential people in our support network are going to be agreeable givers who say yes to everything. But hang on, if you want a culture of rethinking, these are probably not your best allies because agreeable people don't like conflict. They will shy away from challenging you and telling you what you need to rethink. The people who add the most value when it comes to rethinking are the disagreeable givers. People who are gruff and tough on the surface, but they're doing it because they want to improve things. They challenge because they care. They dish out tough love. They give us the critical feedback that we do not want to hear, but we desperately need to hear. The great thing about disagreeable givers is that they will form a different kind of network. Instead of a support network, they are a challenge network. They will be your most thoughtful critics who will tell you what you need to rethink, who will hold up a mirror and help you see your blind spots. If you can identify people in this role from your past, go back to them and say, I know there are times when I have not taken your feedback well. Sometimes I've gotten defensive. Other times I have been on a path and I felt that all the problems you raise are distractions and I just dismissed them, and I shouldn't have. Whether I've been receptive or not, I have always valued the way that you pushed me to get better, to rethink things. And I know I need that. So if you ever hesitate to give me feedback because you're worried about hurting our relationship or hurting my feelings, don't. The only way you can hurt me is by not telling me the truth. You'll start receiving much better feedback from your team. The mistake a lot of us make is we think about these disagreeable givers and we let the disagreeableness overshadow the generosity of giving. We say this person is difficult, as opposed to realizing that these are the people who are being loyally oppositional, who are going out of their way to push us to get better. As leaders, as we gain more power and status, has it become harder for people to tell us the truth? Has it become harder for our team to push us to rethink? Too many leaders don't even realize this power distance as it builds. Here are 2 tips. It makes a huge difference to criticize ourselves out loud. It's one thing to say, I'm open to criticism, give me any feedback. versus, I think I rambled in that meeting, or I dominated that conversation. What should I have done differently? If you are using the latter, then you are proving that you can take it, and your team members will be a lot more willing to give you that critical feedback. Here's the second tip. After doing something like giving a presentation or chairing a meeting, ask your team members to rate you on a 1 to 10 scale. Now, rarely will anyone give you a 10 rating, and that opens the door for you to ask, well, you gave me a 3 or a 6, and my goal is to work towards becoming a 9. What can I do differently to close the gap to 9? They will be less shy after that and not too worried about threatening your ego. Next, let's come back now to how do we rethink and create open and engaging team dynamics from remote collaboration. A lot of organizations back in March 2020 brought their teams together on Zoom and Microsoft Teams to brainstorm. Now, this is great to see, except for one problem. It doesn't work. Now, decades of research have shown that when people come together for brainstorming sessions, they are less likely to produce a lot of good ideas versus if you were to get them to work individually first. Now, 3 things tend to go wrong in brainstorming meetings. The first is production blocking. We cannot all talk at once, and so some ideas get lost. The second is the ego threat. I don't want to look like an idiot, and so I hold back on some of my original ideas. And the third is conformity. People are always concerned, especially in our culture, about the hippo effect or the highest paid person's opinion. Right? As soon as that's known, people jump on the bandwagon, and you get too much convergent thinking and not enough disagreement and divergent thinking. Now, all of these 3 problems are magnified if people lack power and status. If you lack balanced diversity, for example, if you're the only woman in a group of men, or the only one team member from a different ethnic group, or perhaps the most junior person in the room, people like that will have even more difficulty speaking up and to challenge everyone else's assumptions or to provide a different perspective. But in many cases, that different perspective is valuable. One way to overcome the issues around brainstorming is brainwriting. All you do is you give people the problem or the prompt in advance, and you let them come up with their own individual ideas. Then you bring all the ideas together, and then you ask the group to do what it does best, which is to evaluate and refine. The reason why we want to do that is individuals on average have more brilliant ideas than groups do. They generate more variety, and they also have more stupid ideas than groups do. Because groups have that moderating or aggregating effect. And we want the wisdom of the group to evaluate which of these different ideas have potential and are worth exploring. Now, the chat window in Zoom or Teams or Gmeets is great for brainwriting. As the team leader, state the problem or challenge for the group to tackle. Ask people to write down their thoughts and organize them individually. And when they're done, to write it into the chat window so that we can all see the different individual ideas together and begin a discussion about which direction we should take. There are usually 2 patterns of interactions with remote teams based on messages flying back and forth amongst team members. The first is high intensity, low frequency. And the other is more frequent interactions, but less intense. The second group would be in touch multiple times a day, but it's more spread out throughout a typical, over a period of time. Now, which pattern is more productive and more creative? Most senior executives have bet on the second profile. They say you need regular touch points with your team. But the research data shows the exact opposite. In the first pattern of interaction, teams have separate time periods for individual and group work, and that means they are able to progress on their own projects. And when they do come together, they experience what's called burstiness. When your collaboration is literally bursting with energy and ideas, it's not just that you can build on each other, it's motivating as well to know that someone is online waiting to respond to you. What the bursty teams do so well is what most of us have failed to do in the past year. which is to block out shared work times when we can get together as a group, knowing that someone is online or available to react or give feedback, just like when we are working in the same room or area in the office. Also, they block times for quiet individual work to reduce too much distractions and to create space for their individuals to think and work alone. At a Fortune 500 company in India, remote teams were assigned quiet blocks of time, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays, where no meetings, no emails were allowed before noon, just to focus on their core work tasks and projects. When individuals self-managed this policy, productivity improved by 47%. But when the policy was picked up and managed by the company, who monitored actual compliance to having no meetings and no communications or interruptions in those mornings, productivity shot up by 65%. Because people knew then that they had at least 3 blocks of time a week to focus, to find flow, and to get absorbed in deep work and concentrate, and they could therefore make meaningful progress. Now, after lunch, when teams opened up their inboxes, they often saw that they had multiple duplicate questions. For example, 4 emails on the same question. And instead of having had to respond separately at different points in the day, they could just invite those 4 people into one shared conversation and address the question together. And this would also have helped them to connect, since some people may not even have realized that different colleagues were working on the same issues. And that's where that shared work time comes in. The next tip is about getting in sync. Now, it's not rocket science to create team norms with dedicated meeting times, impromptu collaboration times, and blocked out individual work times to have successful hybrid and remote work. But that requires rethinking, when do we need to communicate synchronously on the same live meeting and when it is okay to be asynchronous. In our work culture or in our collaborative work, what are we actually doing right now? Are we playing an individual sport? Are we running a relay? Or is this a true team sport? If the project or the work that you're facing is an individual sport, like gymnastics, where everybody gets on their own bar, has their own routine, and the overall team score is the sum of individual scores, you can stay asynchronous. You don't need a lot of coordinated time, and you don't need to be in the same place. If, on the other hand, you are more in a relay sport, like the 4x100 meters race, you definitely need the person who is handing off the baton to talk to the person receiving it. You also need the person starting the race to talk to the person finishing the race, to make sure that you're all running towards the same destination. In that kind of work, you need a little bit more synchronous time for people to collaborate and to sync up. Now, where you really need to have people on site, or if they are not in the same location, to have frequent live meetings and interactions over Zoom or Teams, it's when you're playing a team sport like football, where I pass the ball to Johan, he passes it back to me, and then I send it off to Sarah, who sends it back to Johan again, who then sends it back to me again. If everyone's expertise is truly needed at every phase, if everyone has multiple contributions to make along the way, that's when we want to be in the same room, or at least in the same virtual room. The fifth and last principle to highlight is to address culture in the remote world. Now, one of the best things that we can do as a team leader, whether we will be back to work together in the same office or to continue fully or partially remotely, is to rethink our assumptions about our team culture. We used to assume that cultures are created by leaders, top down. And while that may be true in a lot of ways, what is also true today in every industry, in every country, in every company, that there are culture carriers throughout the whole organization, down to the rank and file. These could be middle managers or junior employees who go above and beyond to live and enforce the values and norms. These are the people that everyone looks to and says, well, who we are and what kind of behaviors are acceptable or unacceptable around here, I get it from them. I see what they do. I see what they're saying. Now, most senior executives actually have no clue who these culture carriers are in their organizations because they're not present in the room when these behaviors are happening. The other thing is that sometimes these culture carriers may actually be underperforming at work because they are taking on besides their full-time jobs, they're also taking time to onboard new team members by pulling them aside to tell them, hey, I noticed you did this or did not do this, but I want you to know that's not how we operate around here. They tell stories to reinforce what the culture is all about. As leaders, we need to shield these culture carriers so that they don't burn out or get overloaded. But also, we need to empower them. These culture carriers today are so important and are so underutilized. If we don't know who they are, we can't make sure that they are shaping everyone else's perception of the culture. My favorite way to figure out who these culture carriers are is to ask people. If you can only meet one person in this team, and after talking to that person for just 10 minutes, you'd be able to understand what our core values really are, who would that person be? If you ask enough people this question, you will get some consistent names, and those are the people who are your culture carriers. You want those people to be in charge of onboarding and recruiting. You want these people to be speaking at town halls and all-hands meetings. These are the people who will set the tone for what your team culture is all about. Another technique is to ask team members, not what they think the team's culture or values are, but to ask them to come up with a story when the team was at its best. And then collect and analyze these stories. These stories can surface who the culture carriers are, right? Who often are the people who are represented in these stories, and also the aspirational values that are identified. Now, these stories not only highlight the values from the past, but are a map to where we want to take our culture. So, how do we get started to build an empathetic culture? It starts with trust, and building trust starts with vulnerability. Team members need to believe that you truly mean what you say, and that changes that you propose will last and won't go back to the normal, this is the way we've done it, or culture of the past. Honestly, building trust is hard, especially with remote teams when there's awkward silences and screen freezes and lags. Trusting totally is about giving others the benefit of the doubt, not assuming negative intent, negligence, or even incompetence, but to listen actively first and dig beneath the surface to understand real underlying motives and circumstances. Trust is also about actively creating safe spaces for our teams to explore their issues and to bounce ideas off one another. It's creating virtual water cooler moments, virtual office hours, and putting ourselves out there to our teams and taking on all the issues, criticisms, and concerns head on. There's a story about a CEO of a Malaysian public listed company who used to be very comfortable with his quarterly town halls for his staff in the office. He would walk into the company hall, read the script prepared by corporate communications, and he would use his body language and charismatic presence, shake some hands, high-five employees, and excite the crowd to move forward with the business plans. Now, when the whole company moved to a work-from-home arrangement, he found out that when he got on a Zoom video call and tried to read a script, it fell flat. No one engaged, no one was clapping, and no one to high-five. In fact, employees even felt disrespected because it came across as trite and rote. Now, after advising him, we got him to change the format, where he first records a video on business updates and sends it ahead of time so that employees could watch it before the Zoom town hall. And during the meeting itself, he used an Ask Me Anything format, where people could write in questions with an option to submit those questions anonymously. There was no script. And he had to answer the questions voted the most by employees, and he couldn't evade, and he couldn't selectively pick the ones that he liked. And how did he respond? Authentically and honestly. Now, he's using this space now to get feedback from everyone on the front lines about the challenges and opportunities they are experiencing. This has transformed the way that he engages with his employees, and it has made him a better leader. He is much more inclusive now of those that were not present in the office during town halls in the past, especially employees from branches and locations outside of the office. By being vulnerable and sharing about what he doesn't know or what worries him and what keeps him up at night, he has built stronger bonds of trust with his employees. Now, before we close and move on to the Q&A, I want you to take a minute and ask yourself, What actions are you going to take away from this session and implement within your team? What can you do to visibly create a team culture where the best work is truly acknowledged and celebrated explicitly? What can you do to communicate carefully and deliberately, from simply writing more clearly to making sure that there is an understanding of priorities and next steps? Will you collaborate more confidently by creating a cadence of regular feedback, by breaking silos and promoting cross-team collaboration? Or will you trust totally by assuming positive intent, showing your vulnerabilities, and to create moments of informal social connections? Now, I truly believe that this is the moment to not go back to the ways of working in the past. This is the moment to go forward. This is the moment not to be excited to just sit in our office seats, but instead transform the way that we work to be less geographically based, less visually based, more inclusive of everyone everywhere. I hope you'll join me and ask yourself how you can build empathy for all those counting on your wisdom, your creativity, and your heart. Thank you.